I have first Mr. Opal for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. We'll start with the legal counsel for Sikh organizations for Sikh Federation Canada. Prabjot Singh, thank you for being here. Obviously, from what you're outlining, there's a very, very serious situation with foreign interference from India. I know we heard from the RCMP cases of intimidation, a lot of it to the Sikh community, violence, extortion, assassination, and attempts on a number of other lives as well. The Prime Minister admitted that for a number of years that they have known about foreign interference from India, and yet they failed to take action. They failed, frankly, to protect Canadians from that foreign interference. One thing I want to start off asking you about is that we have seen a significant amount of misinformation coming from India. We saw a lot of this during the farmers' protest that happened a couple of years ago. We saw this again, maybe most recently, with some of the unfortunate instances that we saw in Brampton. Have you tracked or seen this information? And what have you seen the government's response, the Canadian government's response on this disinformation coming from India?
So I think on that disinformation issue and foreign interference more broadly, as I outlined, that this is an institutional issue that's plagued successive governments for the last 40 years. There's been evidence on the record in public media reporting and other government documents that India has been engaging in foreign interference and that there has been some degree of awareness of those activities in this country. As you pointed out, the question of disinformation is particularly dangerous, not only because India's disinformation kind of bolsters racist stereotypes about Sikhs and trying to paint the entire community as extremists and terrorists, but it is also targeting Canadian institutions all across the board. And Weldon Epp, who's the ADM for Indo-Pacific, has noted that India has a massive potential to engage in this kind of disinformation activity. When you talked about the farmers' protest in particular, during that period, the rapid response mechanism that's housed in global affairs had started operating around that time, and it noted that India was engaging in significant activity that was targeting Canadian officials, government officials, and the Sikh community in particular. And I think one issue, in addition to this narrative of Sikhs are extremists or terrorists, there is a concerted effort by Indian actors to paint a political difference around issues of political rights in Punjab as a sectarian conflict. So the RRM did actually observe in 2021 that pro-BJP outlets were trying to manufacture and amplify a narrative of tension between the Hindu and Sikh community in the country, and that there was some degree of insecurity. Earlier this year, in March 2024, CSIS has actually provided a high-level security briefing where they talk about the fact that India engages in foreign interference, particularly with its Hindu nationalist agenda kind of at the forefront. And one of their objectives is to actually target and marginalize Sikhs from political life in Canada altogether. So the impacts of this foreign disinformation and this kind of interference is not only in terms of electoral interference, but it has corrosive impacts on social cohesion by trying to paint sectarian conflict in Canada where it doesn't actually exist. In terms of the government's capacity, in terms of that rapid response mechanism, one of the most shocking things is that in 2021, by the RRM's own account, its analysts and its employees and those involved in that project didn't actually have familiarity with non-Western media ecosystems like India, and it noted particularly that this makes Canada vulnerable to Indian disinformation and the amplification of those kinds of messages. So there's a lack of familiarity. There was an acknowledgement that that was the case. The mechanisms or methodology particularly concentrated on mainstream messages or political leaders, not actually trying to differentiate how is Indian disinformation targeting the community or acting in Canada particularly. So there's a methodology that's clearly ineffective. There's a lack of familiarity. And to my understanding, as of the spring of this year, there's nobody within the rapid response mechanism that even speaks Punjabi or Hindi, which is the language of choice of Indian disinformation. And even broader than that, even within civil society, the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which is an academic resource to monitor disinformation, also doesn't have those resources. So we're looking at a country with a juggernaut of a media apparatus and social media capacities that is specifically and aggressively targeting Canada. And it doesn't look like Canada really has any mechanisms or capacity to monitor, understand, analyze, and actually counter that disinformation.
Thank you for that. I just want to get back into something that you had said that about the redaction of documents that clearly took out any notable incidents of Indian foreign interference out of those documents. Can you elaborate a little bit more about why you think that was the case and why that happened? And obviously that that alone would have at that time helped to protect Canadians further, but that was taken out and no action was taken because of it.
I think from the community's perspective, it's particularly shocking because, as I said at the outset, it's not only that the gravity of the threat was hidden consciously from the community and from the public, it was the existence of this threat and how it operates in the first place. So we've talked about how foreign interference by India has been happening for decades. In 2018, after the Prime Minister's trip to India, NZCOP actually published a special report that was meant to look into allegations of disinformation, particularly by David Jean at that time, who was the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. That report was meant to be a transparent mechanism to talk about and deal with the national security and intelligence issues. In 2018, that report talks about Indian intelligence targeting Canadian officials with disinformation to pressure the government to take law enforcement and security actions against Sikh activists in this country based off of that disinformation. That report is significantly redacted and doesn't actually divulge very much detail about the nature of that disinformation campaign, and it doesn't appear that there was any assessment into the potential efficacy of that disinformation campaign to manipulate or pressure Canadian security and intelligence agencies. And from the community's perspective, there has been significant unwarranted activity on that front that we have felt. The more concerning part in 2019, after that, the NZCOP's annual report was all about foreign interference and also Canada's capacity to combat foreign interference. So in that report, there are case studies dealing with Russia and China. And when you're talking about redactions, in those cases, there's redactions and there's a summary of 2 to 3 sentences describing what's the nature of the information that was redacted. So there's a case study of Russian foreign interference, Chinese foreign interference, and then there's a second section that talks about Canadian operations to counter that foreign interference. Throughout that entire report, there's one third section that's completely redacted, and all it says is another country that's targeting foreign interference, Canada for foreign interference. Based off of media reporting from Sam Cooper, I believe in September of last year, who reported on getting access to an unredacted copy, actually outlines that in 2016 and 2017, CSIS had actually been observing an Indian intelligence network that was operating and proliferating itself in Ottawa and in Vancouver with intelligence operatives and developing assets in those areas who are engaging in intimidation.
So thank you, Mr. Singh. We're actually over time. I have Mr. Januis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Singh, you had mentioned, and it's been reported elsewhere, that Indian foreign interference networks in Canada have operated for years and were left undeterred as a result of a political choice made by the government not to disrupt those networks. Is it correct that the government had information about these networks as early as 2016? And why did this government choose not to disrupt the activities of these networks?
So, like I had said earlier, this is an institutional problem of successive governments for the past 4 decades. There's been public reporting on this issue since as early as the 1980s about Indian operatives intimidating community members here in Canada, interfering in media reporting as well as elections over the past 40 years.
Sorry, I'll just admit, my time is tight, and I want to give you the time, but I want to get through a few points. So in the last 9 years, and I understand there's a history here that goes back decades, but specifically that were networks, from what I understand, that were identified by CSIS in 2016. And in 2017, there was a proposal brought to disrupt these networks. And according to reporting we've heard from Sam Cooper, the government chose not to disrupt these networks. Is that correct? Is that consistent with your?
That is correct. When CSIS wanted to dismantle these networks, from based on that public reporting about the NZCOP's actual contents, is that the government chose not to actually engage in that action because it would disrupt their export and trade priorities with India, and also potentially jeopardize the Prime Minister's trip to India. And
Right.
I think that gets to the root issue that successive governments have failed to take action against India. I would say one is because looking at a marginalized, visible minority that isn't seen to be, true Canadians, and their interests may not be the interests of the establishment or the state or that political party, but it's also this priority to foreign policy over the domestic harms, and that's something we've seen consistently, and that's been reported by NZCOP as well.
And I appreciate your point about the history. There's also a present that you're describing, though, which is that the government of the day, Liberal government, made a choice, and you've confirmed that choice. They made that choice in 2016 and 2017, and that choice contributed to the continuing ability of these networks to operate. But something changed, and I know there's an institutional history, but something changed significantly when the Prime Minister made a choice about not disrupting these networks, so that the public image effects of what he hoped for from the trip to India would be there. And then as part of that trip, he signed an intelligence sharing agreement with India. And I think you'd agree that the Prime Minister, knowing about these information networks, these interference networks in Canada, choosing to sign that intelligence agreement in spite of what he knew, that changed the dynamic, because that meant a kind of sharing of information between Canadian intelligence and Indian intelligence that didn't exist before. Could you share with us what was your advice to the government at the time about that kind of intelligence sharing system, and what have you seen since have been the effects of that decision by the government?
So the community has been unequivocal since as far back as the 80s that any kind of intelligence and information cooperation or agreements with India are incredibly dangerous and have led to the loss of life potentially in the past, and is continuing to do harm in Punjab and in Canada today. So even in 2018, when that agreement, that cooperation framework was signed, the community was unequivocal and was very resolute that this agreement should not have been signed in the first place, and it should be suspended immediately, particularly given the revelations.
Why then did the Liberals choose to sign it, in your view?
So if you look at particularly that 2018 report by NZCOP, it's heavily redacted, but when you read between the lines, India was significantly pressuring the government of Canada around these security cooperation issues and amplifying this narrative of Sikh extremism. When you read that report, officials from the government, and including from the public service, are described as having a strong priority to convince India that Canada is taking their concerns seriously, and took a number of steps, including signing that agreement. What I would suggest is to appease India and further foreign policy priorities.
Let me get one more question in. I asked an order paper question to the government if any intelligence sharing between Canada and India contained information about Mr. Najjar. The government refused to answer that question either way. And I was surprised by that. If the answer was no, they could have said no, but they refused to answer the question. What's your reaction to the failure of the government to answer a question about whether intelligence was shared with respect to Mr. Najjar?
It's incredibly concerning, and there needs to be immediate transparency and immediate action to put an end to that agreement and any kind of cooperation that targets political dissidents in Punjab and in Canada. And we have seen evidence of harm coming to individuals in Canada and in Punjab on both sides of these interactions that puts members of the community in harm's way and harms their well-being.
Thank you, Mr. Genuis.
Mr. Ripple for 5
I had-
minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, for almost a decade now, this government's kind of soft on crime approach, loose border policies has contributed to the fact that organized crime elements in Canada have increased. We've seen highest levels of violence in this country that we've ever seen. Extortion, shootings, arsons. Mr. Alcock, would you agree that criminal environment here in Canada, with much easier to get bail now, lesser sentences in Canada, that it would contribute or maybe create a pathway, make it easier for Indian agents to use criminal activity to carry out that work here?
No, not particularly, Mr. Chairman. I don't think those things are related. I think the Indian interference, I think, as the previous witness said, a lot of what we see now in terms of Indian interference is a product of the current Modi government and its ultra Hindu nationalism. That I think has driven much of what has come to light in the last year or so.
Thank you very much. Mr. Elcock, just wanted to address something. It is true that the CSIS Act allows the government to offer information to any Canadian-specific risks on foreign interference without forcing them to get into a sworn secrecy or controlling what they say. That information can be provided to any Canadian if necessary, if there is risk to Canadians?
Mr. Chairman, the issue of classified information always arises, but to the extent that the service can provide some information to individuals, that has happened in the past, including, I assume, recently.
That information can be provided, and which also includes
the issue of classified information does arise. I mean, there is a limit to what can be provided.
No, you still have 3 minutes, actually.
Done.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ripple. Ms. O'Connell for 5 minutes.
Yeah, you want?
Thank you, Chair.
If it's okay with Ms. O'Connell, we
fine.
can pass on the time
Let's see
to
what they got.
Mr. Motz.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just briefly to both witnesses, thank you for being here. It was already mentioned, Mr. Alcock, that you had talked about Indian interference. It's not a new issue, that it's become more pressing concern as of late, as a number of countries have become more aggressive in recent years. As a government, as a country, are we properly positioned with our national security framework to address the emerging aggressive threats of foreign interference in this country? And please, both of you answer. And what do we need to prioritize if we're not?
Mr. Chairman, I think that I can't speak to the level of intelligence that the service has at this point because I obviously don't see that intelligence. So I can't really comment on whether the service has enough coverage to be able to respond to foreign interference. My guess, however, would be that one challenge will be resources. Foreign interference is a consuming task. Terrorism has not gone away, and espionage has increased substantially in the last few years as a number of countries become even more aggressive in terms of conducting intelligence operations in various countries, including Canada. So the challenges of resources are always there. There is a question, too, of whether, to some extent, in a world of review, the service has become more risk-averse in terms of what actions it might take. I can't speak to that. My assumption is that they're doing their job and doing it as well as they can, but they do it within a framework that may not entirely always assist them, and that takes you back again to resources. But having said that, Mr. Chairman, I think certainly the authority that the service has and its ability to operate, those exist. It's really a question of you've got the resources to do it. Years ago, somebody asked me whether, as an intelligence service, we had enough resources. The truth is that no intelligence service ever has enough resources. If you were the old East German Stasi, you had half the country watching the other half of the country, and that probably wasn't enough for the Stasi. That isn't true in Canada, obviously. The resources that the service has are much less than the old East German Stasi would have had. But I'm sure that resources are a challenge in dealing with these issues. Foreign interference is a complicated and difficult area to work in, as both of us have said. The Indians and the Chinese have been much more aggressive in the last few years, so it's more demanding.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. we'll move on
Do
to
I have
Ms.
time to answer the question as well? Is it put to both of us?
Sure. Yeah.
So I'll be quick. I think the response and the concern, I would say and strongly suggest, is that foreign interference is not a security problem per se, and the institutional vulnerabilities and gaps that Canada has is actually a policy issue, and it's primarily that global affairs and the foreign affairs ministry have almost all of the tools to actually combat foreign interference. And so what that leads to is this kind of lopsided approach where foreign policy priorities are consistently prioritized over the actual security and domestic and charter related concerns and vulnerabilities and attacks that Canadians are facing. So as long as foreign policy priorities dictate, or other partisan interests dictate the response to foreign interference, we're not going to be able to actually respond effectively.
Great. Thank you, Ms. O'Connell, for 5 minutes. I have Mr. Motz for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witness for participating today. From your position, obviously the Center for International Governance and Innovation, follows these sort of things as a think tank and has a view that many of us don't always have. And so I'd be interested to know from your perspective, is Canada's legislative framework sufficient to and appropriate to properly combat the rising and the more aggressive foreign interference?
So thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. It's a great question, Mr. Motz. And I would say maybe two things. There's one answer that deals with our legislation. And look, there's a bunch of statutory reviews that we're still waiting for. So I think we should start there. But it's also, there's the legislative reviews and the tune-ups that would be required, but also a national security strategy. Because for me, and I appreciate what we're doing here, we're having one single conversation about one single government in one single area. And it was ditto for the foreign interference commission where we're looking at elections. Of course, it's much broader than that. And so what I would urge is a strategy that looks at the relationship between trade, economic development, intellectual property theft, research support, defense industrial strategy. It's all connected. And so treating them as categorically discrete things, I actually think misses a huge opportunity. And the last thing I'll say is that adversarial states view these areas as strategically linked. And so I think it behooves us to do the same.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to expand on that just a little bit. I know I was very intrigued with our previous witness, Mr. Singh, and his testimony, and he kind of alluded to the fact that sometimes a government needs to put aside our foreign policy for the sake of protecting domestic potential harms. And so when you build a national security strategy, how do you marry those? How do you properly marry those to? Of course, every country. We need to have a relationship with our allies, obviously, in other countries. But we also got to keep our citizens safe. How do we do that and develop a national security strategy that is appropriate for a serious of an issue is foreign interference?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a realist and not in the Clausewitzian sense of the word. Obviously, I realize that there's strong states out there and strong states are going to behave in any way that they see fit. And I think we're on the receiving end of a little bit of that right now, where India is flexing its newfound muscle on the global stage, right? And so this is inevitably one of the things that you're going to see. That being said, I think the highest order of government, the highest concern of government is to keep citizens safe. And so if we're talking about a series of counterbalancing trade-offs, it's awfully hard to trade citizen lives for the purposes of a trade deal. And look, I realize that the world's a complicated place, but I would just say this, that if we're going to be doing a strategy and we're going to be looking at what's the first objective in the first sentence of that strategy, it is the highest responsibility of government is to keep Canadian citizens safe, period.
Thank you. And I appreciate that because I think that is one of the government's first initial responsibilities. Now, does Canada have the capacity to handle the more aggressive foreign interference that we're seeing? Is the current government taking sufficient action on foreign interference? And if not, how can we improve that?
Well, so it's interesting. I mean, the example that I was drawing at when I said we should look at speaking indictments, when that happened in the United States, I mean, you should read how the U.S. treated it. I mean, they caught the guy before he was able to commit the assassination. They deployed a sophisticated undercover apparatus, and then the charging document. It's beautiful. Like this, I mean, I went to law school at Columbia Law, so I know a little bit about the U.S. legal system. This individual's chances of successfully defending that prosecution is about 0%. And so, like, look at the way that it worked in the U.S. They interdicted it before it happened. Look at the way it happened here. Someone lost their life, and now there's an investigation. And so, when I'm thinking about the best way to answer your question, I would start to think about the resources of the RCMP and whether or not that institution, as currently constructed, is fit for service. Because the 21st century is a lot different than the 20th one, and so, what does a modern police force look like that has to deal with everything from sophisticated foreign interference operations to cyber attacks and on and on?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And you almost drew me in to ask a question about the RCMP, but I want to stick with the statement you made about this speaking indictments. It intrigues me. What you're really saying is the role of government in a situation like this is transparency. And that's really what a speaking indictment is, a transparency document. And, how do we address, the transparency or the lack of transparency that's currently happening, and how this government and how any government could handle foreign interference now and moving forward?
Well, I mean, that's it, right? I watched the press conferences the same as you did when the commissioner was out there. I looked at the previous witnesses' testimony. I've read all the reports. So, but it was, for us, it was like drip, 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 right? The story was revealed slowly. And really, when we first heard about it as Canadians, and look, I'm not security cleared, I'm just some guy, right? So I was watching this on TV like everyone else. It was the story was revealing itself quite slowly, and it was unclear. And I think as a consequence of that, we probably did a bit of a disservice for Canadians because they were having a hard time following the shifting narrative. Whereas in the US, it's like you pick up that indictment, you know exactly what the guy did, who he was working with, how he did it. Like there's no room for debate. And so the transparency piece through that mechanism is crystal clear.
Thank you, Mr. Motz.
Thank you, Mr.